I love superheroes. They're my jam. I've been collecting comics for Marvel, DC, and other publishers for around 20 years now. Every entertainment medium, books, movies, television, games, brings something new to the table. Comics have the distinct ability to imagine grand scenarios and bring the creator's visions directly to the readers, unlike books, while skipping movie and television concerns like budget and casting. There's just something about people with cool powers and cooler costumes punching each other that speaks to the human condition. We're lucky to live during a time when superheroes are popular enough to be leaving the comic page and heading into those other mediums with excellent movie adaptations like the Avengers and Captain America: The Winter Soldier, or solid TV adaptations like Arrow. Unfortunately, just like comics themselves are not great, the Clone Saga and Secret Wars 2 come to mind, comic adaptations can end up being downright horrible. So here are 10 of the worst superhero games ever made, games that made comic fans hang their heads and cry. Superman 64. Let's get this one out of the way right now. Superman 64 is one of the worst superhero games ever created. You've probably all heard why. Horrible graphics, even by Nintendo 64 standards. Kryptonite fog all over Metropolis, and Superman racing through rings instead of fighting any crime. Superman's supposed to be a majestic figure, but in Superman 64 that's all undone by even the smallest things, like the weird arm movements Superman has when he turns while flying. Superman 64 was just one in a long line of bad licensed games that developer Titus Software made before it finally went out of business in 2005. Good riddance. Batman: Dark Tomorrow. Now that we've put Superman 64 to bed, let's focus on the other half of the world's finest. Batman: Dark Tomorrow's heart was in the right place. Everything that Arkham Asylum did 6 years later was attempted here first. Commissioner Gordon is trapped in Arkham Asylum with Gotham's worst, and it's up to Batman to save him. It didn't come together as well as Arkham Asylum. Boring combat, repetitive missions, and horrible implementations of all of Batman's best gadgets. The capper to this shameful experience is the game's ending. If you go up against the game's primary villain, Ra's al Ghul, without disabling a device early in the game, you get the bad ending. But they never tell you about the device, so most players finish the game only to be treated to the death of Batman or of a bunch of innocent people. How heroic is that?
It's about the future. The future begins with a gesture of trust.
X-Men Destiny. I had such high hopes for this game. The pitch is great. You don't play as the X-Men themselves, you play as a new mutant who has to join their cause. The idea was you design your character, pick their powers, and then play out a robust action RPG, upgrading your powers and making great, meaningful choices. Silicon Knights talked a big game, but threw an airball when it finally stepped on the court for real. There's no character creation, you just choose between 3 generic nobodies. You have 3 mutant abilities to choose from, and you tackle the same boring missions regardless of what choices you make. The only real choice comes at the end of the game when you decide if you want to join the X-Men or Magneto's Brotherhood. X-Men Destiny was actually recalled due to Silicon Knights' legal battle with Unreal Engine developer Epic Games, so it should be hard for you to find a copy now. Good. Aquaman: Battle for Atlantis. Imagine Superman 64, but instead of Superman, you're stuck playing Aquaman. Aquaman can be a great character with the right creative team, but that's not the case here. You wander through a lifeless Atlantis, wondering who you're even saving, fighting the same enemies over and over again. You don't even really have to play the game, just hit the same button in repetition and you'll probably soar through it. And that Superman 64 comparison is apt here. Even though Aquaman was an Xbox and GameCube release, the crappy models and poor textures reminded players of a bad N64 game. I think the publisher realized they had a lemon here because the game launched at a low price point. It was bargain bin from day one. Avengers and Galactic Storm. Quick, name 10 Avengers. If Thunderstrike, Crystal, or Black Knight are on your list, you could have gotten a job at Data East in the 90s. Avengers and Galactic Storm was a 3D fighting game based on the Operation Galactic Storm crossover in the Avengers comics at the time. It features Captain America, because that makes sense, and 3 other Avengers, the aforementioned Thunderstrike, Crystal, and Black Knight. More mainstream characters like Iron Man, Thor, Vision, or even Giant Man were available in the title, but only as assistants you could briefly call out in a battle. This was a fighting game that featured the Supreme Intelligence as the final boss. If you don't know the character, it's a giant talking head in a jar, like an evil version of Power Ranger Zordon. Here, it's a dude in a suit, because that's all Data East could come up with. Galactic Storm's quality was sad after the awesomeness of Data East's other Avengers arcade game, Captain America and the Avengers. Catwoman. This was the game based on the Catwoman movie starring Halle Berry. It's just as good as the movie. This must have been a mistake or something on my part. Catwoman is an accurate representation of the film it's based on. How many times has that happened? We should thank our lucky stars for this one. Seriously though, Catwoman is a platforming game with poor controls and most of the action takes place on tall buildings. The whole thing is an exercise in frustration and the sole highlight is the Halle Berry character model is actually correct. But the movie's costume was horrible, so that's scant praise. Fantastic Four. Excitement. Let's take Marvel's first family, the heroes based on exploration and adventure, and place them in a rote Streets of Rage style brawler. Fantastic Four is slow, repetitive, and the animation is downright sad. Luckily, you won't spend much time with the pain because the game is only 5 missions long. The only good thing about Fantastic Four is the Carlos Pacheco art they used for the cover. Oh wait, that was just cover art for Fantastic Four 416. Oh well. Spawn the Eternal. When you imagine Spawn, you think of that badass cape. It's even right there on the cover, but the cape is only in this game as a power-up. Spawn the Eternal was developed for the PlayStation 1 in-house by Sony Computer Entertainment, but the developer's knowledge of the console was not on display here. Bad graphics and uninspired levels are met with 2 different control schemes, one for exploration and one for fighting. Basically, they tried to mix Tomb Raider and Toshinden into a single title. It worked about as well as you could expect. It would switch between the 2 on the fly, and SE wasn't experienced enough at the time to integrate the 2. At the very least, Spawn used his fighting game experience to end up in the Xbox version of Soul Calibur 2. Silver Surfer. The Silver Surfer is a former herald of Galactus, filled with the power cosmic. He zips around the cosmos, asking people rhetorical questions and slapping fools down without a smile or a grimace. Developer Software Creations misunderstood and thought the character was made from paper-thin silver, I guess. That's the only explanation for putting the character in a shooter and making him so fragile. One hit from anything in the game can kill the Surfer. Anything. The Surfer touches the walls, dead. Random items, dead. That made Silver Surfer one of the hardest NES games ever. It was the Dark Souls of its time, setting up some rules and sticking to them mercilessly. I guess that's a plus?
Oh, this better be good. I don't have much time.
Marvel Nemesis: Rise of the Imperfects. Instead of looking at Capcom's Marvel fighting games to understand how to create a great fighter, EA decided that it would use the license to establish its own superheroes. Enter the Imperfects, a poorly designed group of misfits that went toe-to-toe with Spider-Man, Wolverine, Captain America, and Iron Man in a thoroughly uninspired fighting game. Moving away from the Imperfects themselves, which were pretty bad, the fighting game part of Marvel Nemesis relies on context-sensitive controls. Unfortunately, they weren't well implemented, so while each character is different, you won't find much depth in any specific character. And then there's the single-player campaign, which hides the fighting game behind a boring beat-em-up. You'll punch through the same bad guys to reach the same areas to fight the same boring Imperfects you fought before. The only real nemesis here is tedium. The Uncanny X-Men for NES. The cover art for LJN's Uncanny X-Men promised a game starring Cyclops, Wolverine, Colossus, Nightcrawler, and Iceman, where you'd have to use all your mutant powers to defeat Magneto. It delivered a top-down action game that could barely hold a claim to the X-Men name. You can select your character in this 2-player title, but they all break down into 2 different directions. Cyclops, Storm, and Iceman have nondescript beam attacks, while Wolverine, Colossus, and Nightcrawler can punch things. The characters have slightly different traits like speed or attack strength, but otherwise they play exactly the same. They even look mostly the same except for their magic of color coding. And your reward for choosing your hero is another painfully hard NES game, much like earlier inclusion Silver Surfer. And like that game, you need to avoid the X-Men on NES at all costs. So there you have it, guys. 10 of the worst superhero games ever created. If you like the video, subscribe to US Gamer's YouTube channel. And if you want to read about games, you need to be reading US Gamer.